Hey, welcome back to the Fight Death podcast. I'm your host, John, and today we're going to talk about trotting out the toddler. Let's get started. So, trotting out the toddler goes hand in hand with the SLED framework that we talked about in the last episode. They work together to help illustrate how the justifications that people give for abortion fall flat every single time. Now, this tool, just like the SLED framework, comes from Greg Koukl, at least to my knowledge. And I'm going to again drop the link to his book, Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions, into the show notes. And I would encourage you to read it if you're pro-life, because even if you're not a Christian, and I know that we have a lot of secular members of the pro-life movement, even if you're not a Christian, the book does a really good job of laying out how an argument works. But more than that, even if you already know how an argument works, the book does a great job of laying out how an argument works on the ground. That is, when you're face to face with somebody who disagrees with you and you're trying to be persuasive. Now, I don't agree with everything that Greg says in that book, but it is a fantastic resource for anyone who's involved in persuading people to join their position. So let's go ahead and talk about trotting out the toddler. Now, unlike the SLED framework, which had multiple component parts to kind of memorize and get you comfortable with, trotting out the toddler is really doing exactly what the name suggests. You're taking an imaginary toddler and you're using that hypothetical person to test justifications for abortion. Now, remember that last episode, we've determined that every single difference between the preborn human organism and the born human organism, whatever you want to call it at those different stages, every single difference falls into one of those four SLED categories. And those are size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. We also determined that none of those kinds of differences are morally significant. If a difference in development can justify killing a child in the womb, it can just as easily justify killing a child after it's been born. These are not the kinds of differences that determine whether or not a human being has value, worth, dignity, or rights. So, since there's no morally significant difference between the child before it's born and after it's born, then any reason we give to justify killing the child in the womb would also serve as a reason to justify killing the child outside of the womb. Flip that, and any reason we give to kill the child once it has been born that doesn't work also doesn't work as a reason to kill the child before it is born. So that is why we are going to trot out the toddler. We're going to bring a hypothetical kid into the room, a 2-year-old, let's say. And anytime somebody gives a reason to try to justify abortion, we're going to ask if that reason would justify killing a 2-year-old. If it doesn't work to kill a 2-year-old, then it also wouldn't work to kill a preborn human being because there's no morally significant difference. So let's talk about a few examples. One thing that pro-choice people bring up very regularly is rape. And I'm going to do a whole episode on how to talk about abortion in the context of rape. And I think that deserves its own episode because that's obviously a very sensitive topic. And also, I see a lot of pro-life people or abolitionists or however you want to identify yourself who don't talk about rape and children conceived in rape in the most effective way. But for now, let's just say, hypothetically, you're sitting and talking to one of your pro-choice friends and they ask you, well, would you at least want to make an exception for women who have been raped that they can seek an abortion? Because after all, It's going to be very painful for them to carry that child, and that child might look like the rapist, and she might have to live with looking that child in the eyes and seeing the man who visited this awful trauma on her. And it is an awful trauma. Rape is a horrible, horrible thing. And so that's why I see a lot of pro-lifers who are willing to make that compromise, who are willing to make that exception. But pro-choicers, I've noticed recently, will call you out if you do say that you're willing to make that exception. And they'll say, well, why isn't that person deserving of life? And they're right. It is inconsistent to say all life begins at conception, but if your father is a rapist, you don't have the same right to live as every other baby that I'm advocating for. But this is getting off track. Let's just ask this. Would the fact that a child was conceived in rape justify killing a 2-year-old? That's the question. Would the fact that a child is conceived in rape justify killing a 2-year-old? And we can change the facts of this hypothetical that they're throwing at us just slightly to illustrate why it wouldn't work for a 2-year-old. Let's say that the woman who was raped and who conceived a child in rape, she chooses to keep that child. And everything's okay for a while. The baby's born, it's healthy, she is working through the trauma. But then one day, after the child turns 2, she wakes up, she gets the baby out of its crib, and she looks at it and says, he's starting to look a lot like my rapist. And as things go, because, kids' faces change over time, as things go along, this baby boy starts to look more and more and more like her rapist until one day she's putting him to bed and she just has a total PTSD episode because he looks exactly like her. It's just totally triggers her trauma. Would an appropriate solution be killing the child? Would the fact that the child looks like her rapist, would the fact that the child is her rapist's son be a good reason to kill that child? And I'm sure that you are saying, no, that would be a very bad reason to kill the child. We wouldn't kill a child because he looks like his father and his father is a bad person. We wouldn't kill a child because his father was a rapist. We wouldn't kill a child if his father, after he had been born and conceived not in rape, his father went out and became a rapist. That wouldn't be justification to kill a child. We don't kill children for what their dad did. So if this wouldn't be a good reason to kill a child who has been born, it's also not a good reason to kill the child in utero, because there's no morally significant difference between the child in utero and the child who has been born. Let's run another scenario. Let's say your friend, instead of rape, brings up poverty and says, well, this child wasn't planned. They weren't expected. And the mother doesn't know how she's going to pay to feed the child. So wouldn't it be better to have the abortion and not have to pay for the child? Because after all, abortions are a lot cheaper than children. Well, let's say that a mother has a child already, and then she loses her job, and now she doesn't know how she's going to pay to feed the child. Is that an appropriate justification to kill that child? And again, we see very clearly, right? The answer is no way. No way is that a good reason to kill a child. So if it won't work to kill a toddler, then it also won't work to kill that same human organism in utero. So I hope you see that this can be applied to any number of situations where somebody brings up a reason for abortion and you trot out a toddler and ask them, would that reasoning justify killing this 2-year-old? Now, the response that you're going to get a lot, and I mean a lot, is, but it's different. And that's where you walk back through the SLED framework and you ask them, what's the difference? What is the morally significant difference? Because every answer that they throw out at you is going to fall into one of those 4 categories: size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. So this whole process becomes recursive, meaning you go back through it again and again and again. You walk through SLED, they bring up a new justification. You trot out the toddler. Then they'll say, but that's different, and you walk back through sled. Now, this can obviously get very frustrating, and this is something you need to keep in mind. This is a conversation that's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen in one sitting. But at least with the sled framework and trotting out the toddler, you are now prepared to defend your pro-life position. So if you have been afraid to jump into a conversation defending the lives of the unborn and speaking up for those who don't have a voice, now you don't have to be. You've got the basic tools. And even if somebody throws something out there that is just totally off the wall and you don't know the answer, you don't have an answer for them, all you have to do, if you've maintained the proper attitude, is look at them and say, you know what? That's an interesting point. I don't have an answer for that right now, but I would love to grab coffee with you in about a week, or grab a beer with you in about a week and talk about that point. And that way you have another opportunity to come back and have a conversation with the same person and keep working on that relationship and hopefully persuade that person to abandon their pro-choice views and come to work with us to end abortion. So that's the end of this episode of the Fight Death podcast. If this content is helpful to you, or if you think it's valuable to the pro-life movement, please subscribe so that I can get a handle on whether I'm helping people out or just shouting into the void. Because right now I'm just sitting in front of my computer in my bedroom, talking into a microphone, and I have no idea whether this is going to be big and helpful and useful for people or whether this is going to be a total flop. If you want pro-life memes, you can check out Facebook. I'm on there as appalling pro-life memes for clumps of cells in their teens. Or you can find the same stuff, mostly the same stuff, posted on Instagram, instagram.com/clumpy teens, CLUMPYTEENS. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.